Beloved God, risen Lord, help us to feel your presence. Help us to find in you our hearts, to find you in our hearts. Help us to see you in the eyes of others. Help us to trust that you are with us always. Amen. Christ is risen. Christ is risen. That's the message today. That's actually the message every Sunday, but especially today. That's because today is special. It's Easter. It's the day we remember Christ's resurrection, the day we celebrate the basis of our hope. And because today is special, the lectionary offered two gospel texts to choose from this morning, something that normally never happens. And because today is special, I chose to read them both. In case you hadn't noticed, the two accounts are very different. In John's gospel, Mary Magdalene goes alone to Jesus' tomb, and finding the stone rolled away, she tells Peter and a man the text identifies only as the beloved disciple, but which scholars believe was John himself. These two disciples set off at once, racing each other back to the tomb. They find it empty, the grave clothes lying abandoned on the floor. With this, the text says, the beloved disciple saw and believed. As the two men then leave, Mary remains behind. She remains weeping at the tomb until someone approaches her. "Woman, why are you weeping?" the stranger asks her. "Whom are you looking for?" Taking him to be the gardener, Mary begins to explain, but the man interrupts her. "Mary," he says simply. And the instant he says her name, she recognizes him as Jesus. That's the resurrection account according to John. The version in Mark is much starker. In this account, the male disciples do not appear at all. Instead, it's only women who go to the tomb. Once again, Mary Magdalene leads the way, but this time, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome are with her too. These women find the stone rolled away and a man in a white robe sitting inside the tomb. "Do not be alarmed," he says to them. "You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." This is what the man in white tells them to do. But instead, the text says, the three women flee the tomb in terror and are too terrified to tell anyone. Scholars believe that this was how the Gospel of Mark originally ended. That's because all the earliest manuscripts end here. Later manuscripts add a short section more in line with the Gospel of Luke. But as it was first written, Mark concluded with this: an empty tomb and the testimony of a mysterious stranger that Jesus had risen and would meet them again in Galilee. The gospel stories may vary, but the core event is the same. Jesus is risen. And yet, the variety of the accounts heighten a question which the great 20th century theologian Karl Barth claims most people bring to worship. A question hidden somewhere in a dark corner of their minds, in all of our minds. They bring it not only at Easter, but every Sunday. And yet on Easter, it's especially important. The question is this: is it true? Is it true? To quote one commentator, is it true that God lives and gives us life? Is it true that God not only established a routine, what we call the laws of nature, but that one day God broke the routine and somehow raised Jesus from the dead? Is it true that something so extraordinary happened on that morning that we can only rebuild our lives on its foundation? Is it true? Is it true that hearing her name, Mary's eyes were opened and she saw her risen Lord? Is it true that he was there to meet all the others and all of us in Galilee? As for me, I'm convinced that it is true. I'm convinced in part because of the sheer power and magnitude of the response that followed those early hours on a Sunday morning. Within a matter of mere days after the event, the world had been turned upside down. A movement had begun on that original Easter morning like nothing ever seen before. One that would change everything, one that would change hearts, one that would transform lives. I'm convinced even more, though, because this has continued right up to the present moment. I have seen it. I am part of it. Let me give you an example. Donna was just 26 when she was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease. The medical name for this is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS. ALS is always fatal. It destroys the neurons in the brain and the spinal cord. The result is that muscles atrophy and the person becomes more and more helpless. This usually begins with the arms and the legs. Eventually, the paralysis spreads to other muscles, such as those that control speech and swallowing. The end usually comes when the disease reaches the muscles that control breathing. This can take many years, however. When she first learned of her disease, Donna was married with 2 small children, but her husband soon deserted her. Donna tried for a time to raise her children alone, but eventually she had to turn them over to the care of her sister. This was the one part of her tragedy of her illness that she never fully accepted. By the time I met Donna, she was in her mid-30s. It was my first day as a chaplain at the hospital where Donna was now a permanent resident. By then, she was confined to a wheelchair. She had lost all use of her legs, but she could still move her arms, only very slowly and with great difficulty. "I'm very glad to meet you," Donna said as I introduced myself. Her voice was faint. Obviously, it was hard for her to talk. As she spoke, she began slowly to drag her right hand across the tray of her wheelchair until it hung limply over the edge. It took me a moment to realize that she was offering me her hand to shake. I took her hand in both of mine and gave it a small squeeze, then lay it back on the tray. "I'm glad to meet you too," I said. Until then, she had been resting her chin on her chest. Holding up her head was clearly very hard for her. Slowly she lifted it, though. When she did, I was completely unprepared for what I saw. She had the most radiant smile I'd ever seen. Contained in it was such warmth, such openness. It was a smile that offered love and invited love. It was a smile, I was soon to learn, which she gave everyone. The fact was, Donna just radiated love. She gave it every minute of her day in both tangible and intangible ways. Donna's wheelchair was equipped with an electric motor. She was able to control it by means of a small, highly sensitive lever. This allowed her to go pretty much everywhere. Whenever she'd hear of a patient or a staff member with a problem or a concern, she'd be on her way at once. In the years that followed our introduction, I got used to hearing the low electric whine of her wheelchair as she moved about the hospital. Wherever she went, she spread warmth, kindness, caring, and compassion. She was like an angel on wheels. One day when I visited her, though, her eyes had an added sparkle to them. As she greeted me, I noticed that her smile also had a hint of mischievousness. "I have something to show you," she said. She nodded to a large envelope on the tray of her wheelchair. "Look inside," she said. My daughter just brought it." I took the envelope and pulled from it a large black and white photograph. It was of a woman. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, but hardened, so that she could have been much older. She was leaning against the counter in an insolent pose, a cigarette dangling from the corner of her mouth. Her eyes were sullen, suspicious. Her turned down mouth surly and sneering. Everything about the woman spoke of hostility, scorn, and rage. "Who is this?" I asked, mesmerized by the image. Dropping her head to her lap, Donna's high, bell-like laugh rang out. Her eyes glittered as she watched me. "It's me," she said, trying unsuccessfully to suppress her laughter. "No," I said, astonished. "No, it can't be." I stared at Donna, then back at the photo, then over at Donna again. Only slowly could I pick out the resemblance. Yes, the features were the same, and yet the picture looked nothing at all like Donna. Donna simply glowed. Her whole countenance shone forth with tenderness, empathy, and loving kindness. Her aura was so pronounced that she almost needed sunglasses. The woman in the photograph was just the opposite. She seemed almost a vacuum light. Her expression a black hole of scornful mockery and rage. "Oh, Donna," I said, staring at the picture. "You look so unhappy here." "I was," she said, her laughter fading. "I was miserable. And I was making everyone else miserable too." "When was this?" I asked. "It was before my diagnosis," she said. "I must have been about 24. "It was before your diagnosis?" I repeated, incredulous. "But if this was what you were like before you got ALS, what happened to you after that to change it?" At once, a smile returned to her face. Slowly, she raised her head. "What happened?" she responded. "That's easy. I found Jesus. That changed everything. Suddenly, it was all gone. All that hurt, all that rage, all that lashing out, it just vanished. And I felt such peace. For the first time in my life, I felt complete. I felt like I had been washed clean, that I could see things as they really were. And they were beautiful, just beautiful. And people seemed so beautiful too, and I loved them so much. By now, tears were streaming down her face. I loved them all so much, she repeated all of them. See, this is why I am convinced that Christ is risen. I am convinced because I believe that I too have seen the risen Lord. I have seen him in the lives of others. I have seen him in Donna. I have seen him in my own life. I see him in all of you here before me. That's because the resurrection was not and is not a one-time event. It's an ongoing reality. It opens hearts. It transforms lives. I have seen it. I have lived it. It is taking place right here at St. Stephen's. It's there for everyone. You have only to listen to Jesus calling your name. You have only to look for him in your own version of Galilee. It's true. It's true. Amen.